At my dad's 64th birthday, he raised a glass and said, "Everything here exists because of me, and when I'm gone, it all goes to your sister." My sister grinned. My mom smirked. I just sat there and nodded because what none of them knew was that I bought the house 4 years ago. The business is in my name. The cars? Registered to my LLC. And that night, I left a folder on the table titled, Updated Ownership Records. I, 32M, watched my dad raise his wine glass at his 64th birthday dinner, the crystal catching the light from the chandelier I'd quietly installed 2 years ago. The dining room was perfect, mahogany table, Persian rug, original artwork on the walls. Everything looked exactly as it had for decades, except now I knew something they didn't. Dad cleared his throat, that familiar commanding presence filling the room. He told us how proud he was of everything he'd built, gesturing around at the house, talking about the family business that had sustained us for 25 years. Then came the words that made my blood run cold. He announced that everything here existed because of him, and when he was gone, it would all go to my sister. My sister's grin stretched across her face like she'd just won the lottery. Mom's smirk was subtle but unmistakable, the same expression she wore whenever Dad chose my sister over me, which had been happening my entire life. They both looked at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction. I just nodded and took another sip of wine. What else could I do? Tell them the truth right there? That would have ruined Dad's moment, and despite everything, I wasn't cruel enough to do that. But 4 years ago, when Dad's gambling debts nearly destroyed everything, I'd stepped in. The bank was ready to foreclose on the house. The business was hemorrhaging money from his bad decisions at the poker tables. The cars were about to be repossessed. And where was my golden child sister then? Living in California, pursuing her art career with Dad's blessing and monthly checks. I'd liquidated my investment portfolio, cashed out my retirement accounts, and taken loans against everything I owned. I bought the house from the bank at auction for 60% of its value. I purchased the business assets through my LLC when Dad filed for bankruptcy. Every car in the driveway was registered to my company. Dad never knew. I made sure all the paperwork was handled quietly, and I let him continue living here, running the business, pretending nothing had changed. I paid the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. For 4 years, I watched him take credit for everything while treating me like an afterthought. The dinner continued with more toasts and stories about Dad's achievements. My sister talked about how grateful she was to have such a successful father, how she couldn't wait to carry on his legacy. Mom mentioned how proud she was of the empire Dad had built. Nobody asked about my contributions to keeping the family afloat during those dark months 4 years ago. After dessert, I excused myself and walked to my car. From the back seat, I retrieved a manila folder I'd prepared that afternoon. Inside were copies of all the ownership documents, property deeds, business registrations, and vehicle titles. Everything was organized chronologically, with a cover letter explaining the timeline of events. I walked back into the dining room where they were still celebrating. Dad was showing off his expensive watch, another purchase I'd technically made possible by paying off his debts. I placed the folder on the table next to the birthday cake and told them they might find the contents interesting. Dad asked what it was, his voice carrying that dismissive tone he used when I tried to contribute to family discussions. I explained it was just some updated ownership records they should review when they had time. My sister laughed and said I was being dramatic, as usual. Mom rolled her eyes and muttered something about me always trying to complicate simple things. Dad didn't even look at the folder, just pushed it aside and suggested we move to the living room for coffee. I told them I was heading home early, that I had work in the morning. Dad reminded me that Sunday was a day of rest, that I worked too much. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd nearly gambled away our family's future was giving me advice about work-life balance. I kissed Mom goodbye, hugged my sister, and shook Dad's hand. He thanked me for coming to his special day, said it meant the world to have his whole family there. I told him I wouldn't miss it for the world. The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my apartment. Dad was calling, then my sister, then Mom. I let them all go to voicemail. I poured myself a scotch and sat in my living room, thinking about the conversation that was probably happening at the house right now. They'd opened the folder by now. Dad would be reading through the documents, trying to understand how his name had disappeared from everything. My sister would be panicking about her inheritance vanishing. Mom would be calculating how this affected her comfortable retirement. The first voicemail was from Dad, his voice shaky and confused. He said there must be some mistake, asked me to call him back immediately. The second was from my sister, angry and accusatory, demanding to know what game I was playing. Mom's message was the most interesting. She sounded almost impressed, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. I didn't call back that night. Let them sit with the truth for a while. Monday morning brought a parade of family members to my office. Dad arrived first, looking older than his 64 years. He sat across from my desk and asked me to explain what those documents meant. I walked him through everything. The foreclosure notices I'd intercepted for years ago, the bankruptcy proceedings he'd somehow ignored, the auction where I'd purchased our childhood home. He kept shaking his head, insisting he would have remembered losing the house. I reminded him about his gambling phase, the months when he'd disappear for days at a time, coming home broke and desperate. He'd been so consumed with hiding his addiction that he'd missed all the legal notices. Dad asked why I'd never told him what I'd done. I explained that he'd never asked. He'd been so relieved when his creditors stopped calling that he never questioned how his problems had disappeared. He'd assumed his luck had turned, that he'd negotiated his way out of trouble. My sister arrived while Dad was still processing everything. She burst into my office demanding to know if this was some kind of revenge plot. I calmly explained that revenge would have been letting the bank take everything 4 years ago. This was just reality catching up with family mythology. She accused me of manipulating Dad when he was vulnerable. I pointed out that she'd been living across the country while I was dealing with collection agencies and foreclosure attorneys. She'd been posting Instagram photos of her latest art installations while I was liquidating my future to save our family home. Mom came last, and her approach surprised me. She sat down and asked me what I wanted. Not what I was planning or why I'd done this, but what I wanted moving forward. I told her I wanted acknowledgement. For 4 years, I'd watched Dad take credit for recovering from his gambling debts. I'd listened to family friends praise his business acumen while I wrote the checks that kept everything running. I'd smiled while my sister talked about her inheritance, knowing she was counting money that came from my sacrifice. Mom asked if I was planning to kick them out, sell everything, leave them with nothing. The question revealed how little they understood me. I explained that I'd spent 4 years protecting them from the consequences of Dad's mistakes. Why would I suddenly become vindictive now? But things needed to change. Dad couldn't continue pretending he'd built an empire when he'd actually destroyed one. My sister couldn't inherit something that wasn't his to give. And I couldn't keep subsidizing their comfortable delusions about who was really holding this family together. Update 1. The weeks following Dad's birthday were unlike anything our family had experienced. Dad stopped going to the business, spending his days in his study, staring at the ownership documents like they might change if he looked long enough. Mom threw herself into researching property law, convinced there must be some loophole that would restore Dad's ownership. My sister flew back from California, abandoning her latest art project to deal with what she called the family crisis. She'd been living off Dad's monthly checks for 6 years, and the reality that this money came from my accounts had shattered her comfortable worldview. I continued my routine, going to work, managing the business remotely, paying the bills. But now everyone knew who was really running things. Dad's employees started coming to me with decisions they'd previously taken to him. Vendors began addressing invoices to my company instead of Dad's name. The dynamic at Sunday family dinners became surreal. Dad would sit quietly while Mom tried to maintain normal conversation. My sister oscillated between anger and desperate attempts to understand how she'd been so wrong about everything. 3 weeks after the birthday revelation, Dad finally asked to meet with me privately. We sat in the living room of the house I owned, surrounded by furniture I'd saved from repossession, and he did something I'd never expected. He apologized. Not just for the gambling or the debts, but for taking credit for my sacrifice. He admitted he'd been so ashamed of his addiction that he'd convinced himself his recovery was his own achievement. He'd needed to believe he'd fixed things himself, so he'd ignored the obvious questions about how his problems had vanished. Dad asked if I hated him. The question caught me off guard because hate had never been the right word. Disappointment, frustration, hurt. All of that, yes. But not hate. I told him about the nights I'd laid awake for years ago, calculating whether I could save everything without destroying my own future. I described the moment I decided to liquidate my investments, knowing I might never recover financially. I explained how I'd watched him rebuild his confidence while I struggled with the weight of carrying our family's secret debt. Dad cried then, something I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral 15 years earlier. He said he understood now why I'd been so distant lately, why I'd stopped coming to family gatherings as often. He'd thought I was just busy with work, but really, I'd been carrying the burden of keeping our family afloat while watching him take all the credit. My sister's reaction was more complex. She oscillated between gratitude and resentment, sometimes within the same conversation. She appreciated what I'd done, but resented that her future had been built on false assumptions. She'd spent years planning how she'd manage her inheritance, and now everything was uncertain. During one particularly heated discussion, she accused me of manipulating the situation to make myself look like a hero. I reminded her that heroes don't usually keep their good deeds secret for 4 years. If I'd wanted recognition, I would have demanded it when I was writing six-figure checks to save Dad's business. Mom's response was the most pragmatic. She started treating me like the head of the family, asking my opinion on major decisions, deferring to my judgment on financial matters. It was what I'd wanted for years, but now that I had it, the victory felt hollow. Update 2. 2 months after Dad's birthday, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called a family meeting and proposed a solution that would work for everyone. I would transfer ownership of the house back to Dad, with conditions. He would enter a formal gambling addiction program and remain in treatment for at least 2 years. He would also work with a financial advisor I chose, with all major financial decisions requiring my approval. The business would remain in my name, but I would restructure it as a family partnership. Dad would maintain his role as operational manager, but I would be the majority owner and final decision maker. My sister would receive a stake in the business, but only if she moved back home and took an active role in operations. My sister was initially resistant, reluctant to abandon her artistic pursuits for the family business. But I reminded her that her art career had been subsidized by the same business she was now hesitant to join. If she wanted to continue receiving family support, she needed to contribute to generating the income that made it possible. Dad was grateful for the chance to regain ownership of his home, but the conditions were non-negotiable. He'd spent 4 years taking credit for recovery he hadn't achieved. Now he needed to do the actual work of addressing his addiction and rebuilding trust. Mom was relieved to have a path forward that didn't involve losing their home or lifestyle. She'd been quietly terrified that I would sell everything and leave them to start over at their age. The transition wasn't smooth. Dad struggled with the reality of supervised financial decisions after decades of autonomy. My sister found the business world more challenging than she'd expected, but she also discovered she had a natural talent for client relations. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to help with the transition, a decision that felt strange at 32, but necessary for rebuilding family dynamics. Living in the house again gave me a different perspective on what I'd saved 4 years ago, not just property and assets, but the foundation of our family's shared history. 6 months after Dad's birthday, we celebrated my sister's first successful business presentation. She'd landed a major client through a combination of her artistic vision and practical business sense. Dad beamed with pride, but this time, his praise felt earned rather than assumed. Dad's therapy sessions were gradually changing him. He started acknowledging his past mistakes more readily and stopped taking credit for achievements that weren't his. The process was painful to watch sometimes, but necessary. One evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, Dad thanked me again for what I'd done 4 years ago. But this time, he added something new. He thanked me for the way I'd handled the revelation. He said a lesser person would have used the truth as a weapon, but I'd used it as a tool for healing. Update 3. A year after Dad's 64th birthday, our family dynamics had completely transformed. Dad had completed his gambling addiction program and was working with a sponsor. His relationship with money had fundamentally changed. He now viewed financial decisions as family responsibilities rather than personal prerogatives. My sister had discovered she actually enjoyed the business world, particularly the creative problem-solving aspects. She was developing new service offerings that combined her artistic background with practical business applications. Her income from the business now exceeded what she'd been receiving in monthly allowances. Mom had found her role as the family coordinator, managing schedules and facilitating communication between all of us. She'd always been good at organizing, but now she was using those skills to help rebuild our family structure. I maintained ownership of the core assets, but had transferred daily operational control back to Dad. Our weekly business meetings had become a forum for strategic planning rather than crisis management. Dad's ideas were often good. He just needed oversight to ensure follow-through. The most significant change was in how we talked to each other. The revelation about ownership had forced everyone to acknowledge realities we'd been avoiding for years. Dad's gambling addiction, my financial sacrifice, my sister's dependence, Mom's anxiety about security, everything was now discussed openly. Dad's 65th birthday was completely different from the previous year. Instead of grand proclamations about his achievements, he thanked each family member for their specific contributions to our shared success. He acknowledged my financial intervention, my sister's new business contributions, and Mom's steady support through difficult times. When he raised his glass this time, Dad said something that made the past year of difficult conversations worth it. He said that everything here existed because of our family working together, and that whatever happened in the future, we'd face it as a team. My sister didn't grin this time. She looked thoughtful, understanding now that inheritance isn't just about receiving something, but about earning the right to carry it forward. Mom didn't smirk. She smiled with genuine contentment, secure in knowing our family's foundation was now built on truth rather than comfortable lies. I didn't just nod this time. I raised my glass and told them that the best inheritance isn't money or property, but the knowledge that your family will be honest with each other, even when the truth is complicated. The folder of ownership documents still sits in Dad's study, not hidden but not prominently displayed either. It serves as a reminder of how quickly things can change when people aren't paying attention to reality. But more importantly, it represents the conversation that finally brought our family together as adults rather than the roles we'd been playing for decades. Some might say I should have handled things differently 4 years ago, demanded recognition from the beginning, or let natural consequences play out. But watching Dad work through his recovery program, seeing my sister discover her business talents, and experiencing Mom's relief at our family's stability convinced me that sometimes the long path to truth is worth taking. The house still looks the same from the outside, but everything inside has changed. We're not the family we were 2 years ago, and that's exactly what needed to happen.